Welcome to this Let's Count lesson all about the census. We're going to consider this key question: what is the census? My name is Alison Hopper and I'm delighted to be taking you through this lesson to help you to find out more about the census and how incredibly important it is to us in the whole of England and Wales and also in our local areas. Have you heard of the census? Do you know what it is? At any point during this lesson, you may want to pause the recording so that you can go and do some research for yourself, to think about a question or to complete an activity that your teacher has set for you. In this lesson, as well as finding out about the census, we're going to look at some information from the census and use it in our work. Here are some links that will be useful to you and your teachers. The first is to the NOMIS website, where all the information from the census is stored. There is a user guide on how to access this information. The NOMIS website allows you to find information about different areas of England and Wales, so you can search for the data relating to where you live or where your school is. In this lesson, we will find out about the census, a bit about the history, and also about what the census is for, what its purpose is, and why it is important. We're going to look at some information from the census, and you're going to gather your findings together and present it in an information text. We'll find out more about that as we go on. Hopefully you will also use the NOMIS website to search the database. Data is information, and the database stores it in a way that it can be organised and searched so that we can find out exactly what we want to know. If you want to do some research yourself on the census, then now is the time to hit pause, because we're going to find out about what the census is in the next few slides. So what is the census all about? The census is a count of all the people and households in England and Wales. A household is all the people who live in a particular house. The census is held every 10 years throughout England and Wales, and it's been held every 10 years since 1801, except for 1941, which, as you probably know, was during the Second World War, and it wasn't possible to organise and hold a census in that year. The last census was held on the 27th of March in 2011, so if your date of birth is before the 27th of March, then you appear in the last census. So how is a census carried out, and what will happen in March 2021? Well, every household is asked to fill in a questionnaire, and the adults answer questions about different aspects of their lives. The questions collect information about all the people who live there, what they do, their jobs, how healthy they are, whether they own a car, what language they speak, and lots more. The information collected from all households in Wales and England is then returned to the Office for National Statistics, and we'll find out what happens to it later in the lesson. This is not a new idea though, and throughout history those in charge of countries have been interested to find out about the people who live there. Nearly 4,000 years BC, the Babylonians, who lived in an area that we now call Iraq, took the first recorded census that we know about. They wanted to know how many people there were and whether there were enough resources, like food, to keep their people safe and healthy. Some other people who were very keen on taking a census were the Romans. They assessed the population so that they could collect taxes from them, and that assessing is where we get the word census from. You may have heard of the Domesday Book. This count was carried out by William the Conqueror in 1085. He wanted to know about all the people in his country and to find how much land was owned and farmed. The king sent royal commissioners around the country to find out the information that he wanted. It was a huge task. If you know about the Christmas story, you may know that Mary and Joseph had travelled back to their hometown to be counted. They were travelling back to be part of a census. So there is a lot of history to the census, but we're going to think about the census as it is now in England and Wales. The census gives us a detailed picture of the population in England and Wales. It's unique because it asks everyone the same questions on the same day in March, giving a snapshot of the population and making it easy to compare data and information from different parts of England and Wales. The census is run by the Office for National Statistics. They work really hard to prepare the questions that go into the census questionnaire for all households in England and Wales to answer. They record all the answers, and then they use the information to create graphs and charts, analysing the information, looking at it in detail to find out about our population and how our society is changing. Their job is vital. So what happens to this information after the Office for National Statistics has analysed it? All the information goes both to the central governments in the capital cities, but also out to local government, health authorities, the people who run hospitals around the country, and other important organisations. It is the local government who use the information to make important decisions and to plan developments so that we all have access to housing, to schools, to hospitals and doctors, that the buses run and that the road system is maintained and developed where it needs to be. The plans that they make help prepare us for the next 10 years until the next census is held. The census taken in 2011 has been informing all the work that has gone on in the last 10 years, and the information that we get from the next census in March 2021 will help them to inform what happens in the future. We've talked about the fact that censuses have been held for thousands of years, and the information can help us to find out about life in the past. The census information from Wales and England becomes available to all over time. You may know of someone who is researching the history of their family or perhaps the local area, and they may use information from historical censuses to help them to find out about what happened in the past. I hope you can see how important the census is. I think we should have a look more closely at what the census can tell us. Here is some data from the 2011 census from one small part of the country. What do you think the information in this table is telling us? Have a look and a think. You may want to pause the recording here. Hopefully you can see that this is telling us how many people live in this area and what their ages are. Why do you think the ages have been split up in this way? We've got children aged 0 to 17 years, adults aged 18 to 29, adults aged 30 to 44, 45 to 64, and aged 65 and over. Why do you think the ages have been split up like that? Where are most children between the ages of 0 and 17? What about adults over the age of 65? Can you describe what most people are doing when they are in those 5 age groups? You might want to pause the recording again to think about or discuss that before we move on to the next slide. We've added in some more data here. The last slide looked at data from the 2011 census, and we've now added in the similar data from the 2001 census 10 years earlier. What can we learn from this data? Let's think about the children who were 0 to 17 in 2001. If you'd just been born then, you will still be in the 0 to 17 group in 2011. But if you were 17 in 2001, then you will now appear as one of the 18 to 29-year-olds in the 2011 census data. So in 2001 they were part of the 1,340 children aged 0 to 17, and now they are one of the 865 adults aged 18 to 29 in the 2011 census. It's interesting to think about how people move around on this chart, and that someone in one age group in 2001 might be in a different part of the chart in 2011. Is there a reason why they might have been on this chart in 2001 but not be on it at all in 2011? Do they still live in this part of the country? What do you notice has changed between the two censuses? Pause the recording and try and spot 3 things that have happened between these two censuses being taken. I'm going to tell you a couple of things that I noticed about this data. I looked at the children aged 0 to 17. That age range is everyone who is defined as being a child, either at school or before they go to school. I noticed that the number has not changed much in those 10 years. It's risen slightly by 47, but that's not a big change when we look at the overall number of 1,300. A bit more of a change is that there are now more adults aged 18 to 29. If I do some rounding and estimating, I can say that the number has increased from about 780 to about 860, which is an increase of around 80. What would that mean for an area if I have 80 more people aged 18 to 29? What do they do? How do they like to spend their leisure time? They might be into sports or enjoy going to the gym. Can the sports centre in this area cope with this larger number of people wanting to use their facilities? They might like to go out to the cinema in the evenings. Is there a cinema or a venue with live music that they can visit? I also looked at the adults aged 45 to 64, and I noticed that, well, there are a lot more in 2011 than there were in 2001. Let's see if we can estimate. If I round the numbers to 1,500 and 1,900, that is 400 more adults in that age group living in this area. What has happened? Where are those extra people living? Where have they come from? Have other people moved out of the area to make room for these people? Or does this tell us that more houses have been built in this area between these two censuses? This data can tell us a story about what is happening in our local area. Pause the recording again and see if, with the things you noticed, you can tell a story about what has been happening over the 10 years in this area. We've had a look at what the data can tell us and what we might want to find out more about. But what about the future? What about the census that is happening in March 2021 and the one that will happen in another 10 years' time in 2031? What do you think the population will look like in this little part of the country over the next 10 years? Fill in those figures and make a prediction about what is going to happen over the next 10 years. It won't be too long until you can find out if your 2021 prediction was right, but you will have to wait a while to see if you're right about 2031. Pause the recording and think about how the population might change over the next 10 years, bearing in mind the stories you've already told about the data for 2001 and 2011. Let's just think about what we have done. We've found out what the census is, looked at some information from the last two censuses, and thought about the story it tells of this small part of the country. This information is passed on to local government and local councils by the Office for National Statistics. It is looked at by the people who look after these areas of the country to see what the information tells them about how their local areas are changing and what they need to do. Are there improvements to services that they think need to be made? And can the data support them in making those decisions? What if we want to look back at historical data? We can look back to data from previous censuses by using the NOMIS website that we mentioned earlier. The link is on a previous slide. What do you think the data would have looked like 40 years ago? Do you think the numbers would be the same? What about the area you live in? Are there new houses in your area? If so, why do you think more people want to live in your area? And what else has changed to meet the needs of the increased number of people living there? You've already considered what things might look like into the future. This is the same data but presented in a bar chart. It is interesting to compare the two different representations of the same data. What can you see in the graph that you couldn't see in the table? And what can you see perhaps more easily in the table? The bar chart compares the 2001 data in the blue bars with the 2011 data in the orange bars. And you can see that the age groups for each census are side by side so that we can compare the totals and see which have increased and which have decreased over the 10 years. So what do you notice and what questions would you like to ask? Data should want to make us ask questions. So pause the recording and note down the things that you notice about the information and the questions that you would like to ask. I'm sure you've come up with some really interesting questions. I'm going to share with you some questions that I had about this data. I want to know why there are so many more adults aged 45 to 64 in this part of the country in 2011 than there were in 2001. What happens when people get to 65 because the numbers drop off for that older age group? Can we say that most of the people who live here in 2011 are aged between 30 and 64? Can we say that these two orange bars represent most of the population in this area in 2011? How could we find that out? What about the second set of bars, 18 to 29? What happens when people get to 18? Because there are far fewer people of that age living in this part of the country in both 2001 and 2011. Looking at the information, what sort of a place do you think this would be? What would you see as you walk down the main street or the high street? What and who might you see if you went into the supermarket there? What sort of things do you think there are for people to do in their spare time, evenings and weekends? What do you think people might complain about? What do they think they need more of? You might want to pause the recording again and discuss the answers to these questions and of course the ones you've asked. What can we do with this information? We're asking every household in England and Wales to fill in the census questionnaire in March 2021. And the Office for National Statistics will then work hard to get the information organised and available to those who need to see it. We've looked at that small part of the data and wondered why there are suddenly more people aged 45 to 64 in that particular part of the country, but younger adults are not choosing to live in this area. What is it about this area that makes that happen? How would you share this information about the changing population of this area with other people? That's going to be the focus for the rest of this lesson. You could create a poster using images and graphs to show how the population is changing. Using graphs and charts on a poster is an interesting way of getting across information, and we will look at that in more detail in a moment. You might decide to write a letter to the local council saying that you've looked at the data and wonder if they have considered what needs to happen to support a changing population. You could explain the changes that you think need to be made in this area of the country in the next 10 years. You could write a letter about your own area using data from the NOMIS website to support what you think needs to change to meet the needs of the population. You could use graphs and tables to support your argument in your letter. Finally, you could design a poster to show how important it is that households fill in the census questionnaire, explaining how the data and information collected is used to make decisions and to create plans for the future. This is an example of something called an infographic. It is presenting information graphically, not just meaning as a graph, but information that has been drawn rather than just written in words. It's a way of showing what is happening using pictures and easy to read graphs. You can see that the graph is very simple. You'd probably get told off in a maths lesson as there isn't a labelled axis or a scale. But it clearly shows that emission rates, pollution rates are falling, and even the text has been written sloping down the line to give extra emphasis. There is one big statistic on the right-hand side, that's 75%. Even if we haven't done a lot of work with percentages and pie charts, the way the information has been presented with a big wind turbine for environmentally friendly power and much smaller images of more polluting forms of generating electricity clearly gets across the message. Pollution from emission is falling and we are producing more environmentally friendly power. So the idea is to use pictures and easy to read information to get your point across. The key messages should be instantly visible without having to read too much. Could you create something like this using census data to get your message across clearly to others? Perhaps you could create an infographic to share what you think needs to happen and how the population is changing in this area or in your own area. This slide has some tips on for persuasive writing, and you may have ideas from when you've done this sort of writing in the past. However you decide to present your findings, a poster, a letter or an infographic, you need to remember who your audience is. Who are you creating this for, and who is going to be looking at your poster, infographic or reading your letter? Make sure that the way you present the information suits your audience. You might be trying to persuade the local council and planners that you need a new sports centre. You will need to use the data that shows the changing ages of people living in your area to support your argument. Think back to other times when you've used persuasive language and perhaps constructed an argument or a debate and used similar features, grammar and vocabulary in this piece of writing. I hope you've enjoyed finding out a bit more about the census and how important it is to encourage every household to fill in the census questionnaire in March 2021 so that we can make sure that the country has the information needed to plan for the future to keep the people of England and Wales safe, healthy and happy. Let's look back at what we've done. We found out what the census is, what the purpose of it is, and learned about this history of the census across the ages. We've looked at data, and I hope you may also have looked at data for your own area using the NOMIS website. We've used the data to tell stories, to ask questions, and we've gathered some findings together and presented them either as information for others or to support a persuasive piece of writing. Or you may have created a poster to encourage people to fill in the census questionnaire, telling them how important their information is to their own area and to the whole of Wales and England. Whatever you've done, I hope that you've enjoyed it and that you will go home and talk to the adults that you live with about the census. Perhaps you will look at the questionnaire in March and see how your information is added, perhaps for the first time, into this huge database of information on Wales and England. This count is important and it matters to us. Thank you.